It was January of 1945. The trees in the Ardennes Forest stood like skeletal sentinels under a sky heavy with snow. A biting wind sliced through the pines, whipping loose flakes across the forest floor. Huddled under a camouflage net inside the frigid hull of my M18 Hellcat, I, Private William Hayes, peered through the fogged periscope. My breath came in short, ragged clouds. The tremor in my gloved hands wasn't from fear, but from the bone-deep cold that radiated through every inch of steel. Just 800 yards away, a column of German armor snaked through the forest. There were 12 of them, mostly Panzer foes, with a single Tiger I at their head. Behind them rolled half-tracks packed with infantry, and bringing up the rear were their fuel tenders. They were headed for a vital crossroads, a road that, if captured, would sever the last supply and reinforcement route for the 101st Airborne Division, currently encircled at Bastogne. I had no orders. I had no authorization to fire. I was told to wait, to observe, to report. But I could see what was about to happen, and I made a decision. Without a single command, without permission, William Hayes squeezed the firing pedal, and everything changed. The rules of engagement had been laid down 3 days earlier in a drafty farmhouse near the Belgian front. I sat hunched over a cold metal table as my commander briefed the crews of the 827th Tank Destroyer Battalion. "No one opens fire without confirmation from command." The officer's voice was flat. "I don't care what you see. I don't care how close they get. We do not give away our position until the order is given." The room was silent. The men nodded. But beneath the surface, the tension was palpable. Everyone knew the enemy was moving, and moving fast. Outside, the German offensive, Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, was in its desperate final phase. On December 16th, under the cover of fog and snow, the German army had launched its last great counteroffensive on the Western Front. The goal was simple: split the Allied advance in two, seize key cities, and force the front command onto the defensive. They had struck with over 200,000 men, more than 1,000 tanks, and with absolute surprise. The American lines had buckled. Some units vanished overnight. Friendly positions were changing by the hour. And in that chaos, many commanders feared that the worst enemy might not be the one in front of you, but the friendly fire from behind. So the rule was clear: wait for orders. For me, that meant an observation post. My 3-man crew and I were dug in on a ridge overlooking a forest road north of Noville, a crossroads town near Bastogne. We had good cover, a decent field of view, and a freezing cold look at the valley below, but no permission to engage. Day and night I scanned. Through my frosted scope I marked tank tracks, counted pines scarred by treads, and sketched enemy movements in a notebook my mother had sent me months ago. I wrote down everything: range, azimuth, wind speed, but I did not fire. One afternoon, I tracked a lone Panzer for nearly an hour as it crept towards a ravine. No orders came. The tank passed. A slow burn of anger churned inside me, but discipline held. I knew my job. I knew the price of a wrong shot. One errant shell could mean a dozen dead GIs or a revealed position that brought the wrath of an entire German battery down on our heads. But as the hours dragged on and more enemy armor moved through the trees, the question changed. Was waiting really the safer option? I wasn't reckless. I was precise. I studied the German columns the way a mathematician studies patterns. I knew how they moved, how they staggered their support vehicles, how they relied on tight formations, and more importantly, I knew where to hit them if and when the time came. I just didn't know yet that the decision would have to be my own. Who was William Hayes? I was not born a soldier. I grew up on the flatlands of Ohio, where the winter wind could peel the paint off a barn and the summer sun baked the wheat fields until they cracked like dry bread. My father, John, was an engineer at a small factory in town. My mother, Anne, taught 7th grade mathematics. I was raised around gears, grease, and graph paper. Even as a boy, I saw the world in angles. I could tell you exactly how far away the factory smokestack was by the length of its shadow. When most kids were playing with slingshots, I was building my own with a pulley and counterweight system, trying to figure out how far I could launch a pebble with absolute precision. I didn't join the Army because I craved combat. I volunteered in 1942 because I wanted to defend my country, and the Army offered a trade, a meal, and a future. I got the trade. The meals were modest. The future depended on surviving this war. By the time I hit Normandy, I was 22 and looked 5 years older. My first taste of real combat came in the hedgerows, where the enemy could be 10 yards away, and you wouldn't know it until they opened up. I watched my friend, Frank Costello, burn alive when a Panzer shell hit our half-track in a roadside ditch. Another, Michael Reed, was vaporized by a mine outside St. Lo. After that, I stopped believing in luck or orders or safe distances. I started believing in patterns, in routines. I studied how tanks moved, where they paused, how long it took a turret to traverse. I started carrying a small spiral-bound notebook in my jacket pocket. Every German vehicle I encountered, I sketched, noting its vulnerabilities, its blind spots. I didn't talk much. The other GIs nicknamed me the Professor, because when I did speak, it was brief, direct, and usually calculated to the second. But when it came to gunnery, I was lethal. Not flashy, not fast, just precise, predictable in the best sense of the word. To the Army, I was a good gunner, disciplined, smart, calm under fire. What they didn't realize, what even my closest crewmates didn't fully see, was that William Hayes was also a thinker, a tactician, not just a trigger puller, but a man who could see the battlefield as a chessboard. And in 3 days, this quiet draftee with a mind obsessed with angles would rewrite the rules of engagement with a single volley of fire. Because sometimes, war doesn't reward the ones who follow instructions. It rewards the ones who understand when to break them. On the morning of January 16, 1945, the fog over the Ardennes was thick and low. It clung to the branches like smoke. Visibility was poor. Sound was distorted. But through my periscope, I saw them. First, the silhouette of the tiger's eye. An unmistakable beast with its long barrel and snarling, squared-off shoulders. Then another, and another. The German column was moving down the forest road like a steel serpent. 12 vehicles, maybe more. It was a textbook armored assault column, neat, tight, disciplined. At the head, acting as a battering ram, was the Tiger, capable of punching through almost anything we had. Behind it followed 3 Panzer IVs, each one fast, efficient, deadly. Then came 2 half-tracks, crammed with infantry. Behind them, the support, ammunition trucks, fuel tenders, a field kitchen. Even the tail of the column was protected by a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, a sign that they expected contact and were ready for anything. Anything except for one unauthorized American gunner in an M18 Hellcat. The road they were on was narrow, barely wider than the column itself. Steep, wooded embankments rose on either side. Thick trees pressed in on them. There was no room to maneuver, no room to disperse. To me, it wasn't just a road, it was a trap. But here was the catch. I had no orders. No one else could see what I saw. Radio contact with my battalion's forward headquarters was weak, intermittent, or non-existent. The only way to reach command was to change position and risk being spotted. By the book, I was supposed to observe the enemy, report their course, and let air power or artillery take the lead. But I wasn't watching a column on the march. I was watching a blade aimed directly at the throat of the American line. That road they were crawling down led straight to the crossroads at Noville. If they took Noville, they would have flanked the defenders of Bastogne from the north. The 101st Airborne, already surrounded, would lose its last major supply artery. The result would be a catastrophe. Tens of thousands of American soldiers cut off in the freezing cold. And yet the tanks kept coming, calm, confident, protected by the belief that the American forces were disorganized, scared, and too overstretched to respond. They were half right. I was scared, I was cold, I was isolated. But I was not disorganized. I was calculating. I knew that if I fired too early, they would scatter. If I hit the wrong target, the rest might get away or return overwhelming fire. But if I fired with precision, at the right vehicles in the right order, I could do what most officers would have considered impossible. I could take an entire armored column apart, and I would have to do it without a single word from command, without support, without permission. I licked my lips, reached for the elevation wheel, took one last look at the formation, and waited for the moment no field manual had ever prepared me for. I had never fired without an order. Not once, not in training, not in France, not even when my instincts screamed at me to squeeze the trigger a few days earlier when that lone Panzer wandered into my sights. But now, looking at the perfectly exposed German armored column, moving like clockwork, I understood something. Waiting was no longer caution. Waiting was suicide. And so, with no radio contact, no green light, and no backup, I adjusted my angle, held my breath, and fired. But I didn't aim for the lead tank. I aimed for the third one. The armor-piercing shell left the barrel of the Hellcat with a deafening roar that cracked the silence and sent a shockwave of snow into the air. It hit the 3rd Panzer IV directly in its side. The explosion sent a concussive thump through the trees. A pillar of fire and black smoke erupted into the fog. Metal shrieked. The entire column ground to a halt, but I wasn't finished. As my loader rammed home the next round, I shifted position, 5 yards to the left, just enough to throw off any German gunner looking for my muzzle flash. Then I fired again, this time at the 6th vehicle. The explosion tore a troop-carrying half-track apart. Its fuel tank ignited instantly. Bodies were thrown into the trees. The fire caught the dry underbrush, lighting the forest floor in patches of orange and black. The Germans were no longer halted. They were panicking. The Tiger at the head of the column tried to reverse, but the column was too tightly packed. Its crew was shouting and gesturing wildly, trying to clear a path. But behind them, the rest of the formation was now bottlenecked, blinded, burning, and trapped. I reloaded again. My crew, now fully awake and understanding what was happening, didn't ask questions. They followed my lead. I fired at the 8th vehicle, a fuel tender. The result was immediate and biblical. The explosion rocked the hillside, sending a tongue of flame into the sky like a volcanic plume. The force of it knocked 2 nearby infantrymen off their feet. The fireball silhouetted the tanks like ghostly shadows. From a distance, it sounded like a full-scale artillery ambush. In reality, it was 1 man, 1 gun, and 1 hunch. But the order of my shots wasn't random. I had spent months studying German doctrine. I knew their reliance on tight formations, knew the logic of their layout, fuel and support at the back, armor at the front, infantry in the middle. By taking out the 3rd vehicle, I had created a physical roadblock. By hitting the 6th, I had jammed the center. The 8th, the fueler, had sealed off their escape and ignited the chaos. It was a chain reaction, a firing solution, a surgical dismantling of the German tactical structure. Every shot was a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. The Germans, now confused and cut off, began firing wildly into the trees. Their machine gunners raked snowbanks and empty trunks. Infantrymen took cover behind the burning hulks, unsure of where the fire was coming from. To them, it felt like a trap, an organized ambush by an entire battery of American tank destroyers. But there was no ambush. There was no battery. There was only William Hayes and a crew that had stopped asking questions. As the enemy scrambled, I moved again, using the forest terrain like a sniper. I knew how to use the angles, knew how far my gun could reach without overexposing myself. Each new position was chosen for cover, for elevation, for maximum confusion. I wasn't just shooting, I was dismantling, and every explosion was another page ripped out of the German field manual. The woods had been quiet moments before the first shell. Now they were screaming. Trees splintered and crashed under the shock waves. Snow, fire, and shrapnel filled the air like confetti from a hellish party. My third shot had set the fuel tender ablaze. My fourth struck a half-track that was trying to reverse. Its wheels were already churning in the icy mud when the shell hit, throwing the chassis skyward in a twisted arc of steel. The German Tiger at the front was stuck. The crew was desperately trying to reverse, but they were trapped between the flaming wreckage and the vehicles behind them that couldn't move without ramming each other. Their tight, disciplined formation, so effective on open ground, had become a steel coffin inside the forest road. From my vantage point, everything was moving in slow motion. I could see soldiers shouting, waving their arms, the confusion turning to panic. German infantry began to scatter into the forest, abandoning their vehicles. Some took cover behind trees, others ran through the snow, tripping and sliding on the frozen roots. One officer climbed atop a tank to get a better view and was cut down by a burst from my coaxial machine gun. The crew inside my Hellcat was sweating now, not from fear, but from sheer physical exertion. My loader's hands were raw. My assistant gunner's voice was hoarse from calling out coordinates. The inside of the vehicle smelled of grease, hot metal, and cordite. But I was ice, focused. Every shot was a calculation. Not adrenaline, not rage, just pure, practiced mathematics. I moved after every 2 shells. Not far. 10 yards here, 20 there. But it was enough to make the German gunners second-guess their aim. The smoke helped, the fog helped, the terrain helped. But the real advantage was that they thought there were more of me. The Germans believed they had stumbled into a multi-unit ambush. Some guessed 4 tanks, others said 8. There were even reports of American artillery batteries in the hills, though no such batteries existed in this sector. The truth was that it was a single M18 Hellcat with a crew of 3 and a gunner who was supposed to be following orders. By the 30th minute, the road was a junkyard of burning steel. At least 5 vehicles were destroyed. 3 more were crippled. The surviving crews from the fuel and support vehicles at the rear of the column had already turned and fled back down the forest path. The Tiger finally managed to swing its turret around, traversing toward the ridge where I had last fired from. I didn't flinch. I waited. I knew the Tiger's armor was thickest at the front, but weaker on its flanks. And if you knew the exact moment it was turning, when the chassis exposed just a sliver of its side as it shifted, that was your window. My 5th shell left the barrel and found its mark. A bright, hot flash seared the Tiger's side. For a second, it held. Then, the internal ammunition cooked off. The entire turret blew straight up in a column of fire, landing several yards away from the hull. The blast was so powerful, it knocked the German anti-aircraft gun at the tail of the column off balance. Its stunned gunners dropped their weapons and fled into the woods. Smoke was now pouring into the forest like low-hanging clouds. The wreckage glowed under the gray morning light, and the road that had once been an artery of armored might was now a burning bottleneck of ruin. One of my crewmen looked over at me and said, "They aren't going to court-martial us for this, are they?" I didn't answer. I just loaded the next shell. The job wasn't done yet. Hours later, under interrogation at a makeshift American POW camp, a captured German lieutenant, his face smeared with soot, his uniform half burned, his eyes glazed with shock, struggled for words. He spoke in fits and starts, stammering, pausing. "There were many guns," he said in broken English. "Maybe 6, maybe more. We were attacked by an entire battery." The American intelligence officers looked at each other. There was no battery. There wasn't even a full unit. There was just one M18 Hellcat and a gunner who had never officially been given permission to fire. Other German prisoners described it differently. Some said it was an ambush by paratroopers with anti-tank rifles. Others claimed the Americans had laid mines and traps, evidence of sabotage, not artillery. One kid, barely 20, swore he saw muzzle flashes from 3 different directions. But the flashes were all from the same source, from me, moving after every shot. In their confusion, the Germans had started inventing enemies that didn't exist. Fear was filling in the gaps. Even veteran tankers reported seeing the silhouettes of American armor deeper in the woods. In the chaos of the burning wreckage, the smoke, and the collapsing chains of command, they were imagining what they couldn't identify. It wasn't cowardice, it was psychology. They simply couldn't believe one man had done this. It was impossible to them that a single tank destroyer could strike with such timing, such precision, and such devastating effect. And in a way, they were right. It wasn't brute force. It was surgery. My decision to fire on specific targets, the 3rd, 6th, and 8th vehicles, had followed a logic that no German unit was prepared for. German doctrine had taught them that American forces were slow to react, overly dependent on orders from above. Americans were supposed to be effective only in numbers, not in improvisation. But I had broken that expectation. I had thought like a German commander, and then I had struck like a ghost. One prisoner described it as if the trees had opened fire. Another claimed he heard whistling sounds, which could have been a delayed memory of the shells or just the wind in the trees, distorted by fear. When the American infantry moved in to clear the road hours later, what they found stunned even hardened veterans. The wreckage looked like the aftermath of a coordinated airstrike. Vehicles piled up like dominoes, burned out husks fused together by the heat. Frozen bodies scattered in the snow, some still clutching their rifles. Trees splintered like toothpicks. Tank treads twisted sideways, dug deep into the earth. But above all, the thing that was missing, the thing that made it so strange, was the absence of any American dead. There were none, because there had only been one gunner. From that day on, the survivors of that German column would refer to the incident with a single phrase: the Phantom Battery. For 48 hours, I expected to be arrested. After the firing stopped, the smoke cleared, and the Germans had either fled or burned. I sat inside the Hellcat, motionless. My loader offered me a swig from his canteen. I didn't answer. The adrenaline was gone. Now the fear set in. We had disobeyed a direct order. We had opened fire without authorization, and no matter how many tanks were burning, the Army had rules. Back at battalion headquarters, I submitted my report. My commander, a captain named Lansky, read it without a word. He turned the pages. My sketches, my range estimates, my diagram of the firing sequence. His face was a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You know," Lansky finally said, "if this had gone wrong, if even one of those had been friendly?" I nodded. I offered no excuses. "I knew what I saw," I said simply. Lansky stared at me, then let out a breath. "No one authorized this, Hayes. You understand that?" "Yes, sir." Lansky didn't reprimand me. Not yet. Instead, he said, "Go get some rest. I have to send this up." Up meant division command, which meant scrutiny, which often meant punishment, especially for an enlisted man who had operated outside of protocol. I went back to my crew. They were quiet, too. No back-patting, no celebration. Everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. But it didn't. Not right away, because something else happened first. The scouts from the 101st Airborne arrived. They had pushed out from Noville 2 days later, their faces gaunt, their eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep and life in a foxhole. They had expected to find that forest road swarming with armor. Instead, they found twisted German wreckage. They asked what unit had destroyed them. Lansky said it wasn't a unit. It was a single gunner. The story spread faster than orders. In mess halls, in supply lines, over regimental radio chatter, men started talking about the kid from Ohio who had taken out a tank column by himself. Some exaggerated the story. They said it was 10 tanks. They said he did it with 5 shells. They said he had used ricochets like a pool shark. But in the midst of the budding legend, the official inquiry began. Division intelligence studied my field notes. They interviewed my loader, my assistant gunner, even tried to reach higher command to confirm my radio situation that day. They couldn't prove insubordination because there was no clear record of orders received. The lines had been jammed. My crew had tried to report. There was no response. What they could confirm was the tally. 7 vehicles completely destroyed, 4 more disabled, 0 American casualties. 1 strategic objective, the northern road at Noville, held. 1 cut-off and besieged airborne unit reconnected to its supply lines. And 1 decision, made in silence without permission, had kept that corridor open. Lansky was called in for the final decision. He expected a reprimand. What came back was more unusual. The division commander said, "Don't put this in the official summary, not yet, but tell your gunner, we'll be watching his work." I didn't get a medal, not then. But I wasn't court-martialed. In fact, I was quietly assigned to train other gunners on firing sequence theory, how to disable columns with sequence, not just brute force. No one said the word hero. No one saluted. But I was asked to diagram my decision-making process, and my schematics were sent to the armor school at Fort Knox. That's when it hit me. They weren't just forgiving what I did. They were studying it. Lansky came to me one night, a few weeks later, as I was cleaning the breech of my gun. "You know," Lansky said, "I was ready to report you for insubordination." I looked up. Lansky shrugged. "But then I read that line in your notebook, the one about a controlled collapse." "What did you mean by that?" I wiped my hands. "You pull 1 stone from a wall," I said. "The rest comes down if you know where to pull." Lansky smiled. "Well, next time you decide to bring down a wall, just give me a heads up." I didn't smile back. I just nodded. Because to me, it wasn't a victory. It was a solution, a calculation, a necessity. And deep down, I knew it could have gone the other way. I had made my peace with that. But war doesn't always punish insubordination. Sometimes it learns from it. William Hayes never asked to be remembered. He kept no journals. He posed for no photographs. After the war, he went home to Ohio, married a girl named Ellen from the next town over, and opened a small repair shop outside of Toledo. He fixed tractors, built grain silos, and taught his son geometry by drawing angles in the dirt with a stick. He never once called himself a hero, but others did. Because years after the Ardennes, the Army quietly began teaching what they called asymmetrical target sequencing. It was a technical term for a deceptively simple idea. Don't aim for the head, aim for the collapse. They used a single engagement outside Noville in Belgium as their case study. They showed grainy aerial maps of the forest road, diagrams of the wreckage, the vehicle layout, the firing trajectories. No names were used. The file wasn't secret, but it was buried in textbooks on armor doctrine that most officers never read. Still, cadets at Fort Knox and later at West Point studied it because it worked, because it saved lives, because it changed the understanding of what a single gunner could do. Not with firepower, but with geometry, with logic, with the willingness to act when the orders went silent. Years later, a colonel who had studied my battle as a young lieutenant summed it up. He didn't break an order. He operated beyond it. It was the ultimate paradox. The man who disobeyed the chain of command became a model for battlefield flexibility. His informal firing technique was later integrated into Cold War doctrine, especially in training tank destroyer crews to disable Warsaw-packed armored columns in Eastern Europe. The concept, create artificial bottlenecks by selectively engaging targets, then use the enemy's own formation discipline against them. It was revolutionary, and it came from a kid from Ohio who had never been to college. Decades later, a military historian stumbled upon the original field report filed by Captain Lansky. Buried in a cardboard box of World War II after-action reports, it was stamped with a faded red line. The historian tracked me down, now in my 80s, quiet and a little hard of hearing, living in a modest house with my wife and a cat named Rusty. He asked me about that day in the forest. I didn't answer for a long time, then said, "I remember the trees. I remember how quiet it was before the first shot, like the world was holding its breath. I didn't speak of victory or glory or regret, only of precision, only of necessity. When he asked me why I didn't wait for orders, I told him, because by the time the radio worked, it would have been too late." I paused, then added, "I didn't break the rules. I just stepped outside of them for a minute, just long enough to do what had to be done." That answer never made it into the official histories, but the historian remembered it. And now perhaps you will too. William Hayes didn't win the war, but he saved a road. He saved a column of GIs. He saved a moment. And in war, sometimes, that is everything. He reminded the Army that courage is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it calculates, and sometimes it squeezes a trigger. Not out of defiance, but out of a deeper sense of duty. One gunner, one decision, one sequence, and an entire German column brought to its knees.